So welcome, Facebook parents. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Julie. I'm with Tina's team, and joining us today is Mr. Dave Fendel. Dave is the Social and Emotional Learning Coordinator with the Contra Costa County Office of Education. And if you look in our archives, you will see that Dave was actually with us last fall when helping us to learn how to support our kids during distance learning. And now, obviously, that's changing, and Dave's been very busy going to training and finding some great ways for us to know how we can support our kids as they transition back to in-person learning and hybrid learning. So thank you so much, Dave. I know you've been so busy this year.
It's my pleasure.
So Dave, you're the father of two boys, right?
I am. I have a 14-year-old who's a freshman in high school, and I have a 9-year-old who is in 4th grade. So our first step is to help our kids feel supported and help our kids feel safe and help them feel calm. We know that a calm brain is a learning brain. And so if kids are agitated or if kids are in a state of anxiety, they're not going to be able to access those things they need to learn, right? Their working memory, their critical thinking, those things then take a secondary role to the emotional centers of our brain and that fight, flight, freeze response for survival.
And that makes sense. We've all experienced that ourselves as adults, where when we're feeling a great deal of anxiety, we aren't able to think straight. So.
That's a great point, Julie. And it's actually a lot of the work that I do is with adults and adults managing their emotions and recognizing their emotions. One activity I often lead people through is to think about a time when you were under extreme stress and think about how that affected your work life or affected your personal relationships. And people can make that connection because they can relate to that, because we've all had a moment in our lives where that was true. And so the more we learn skills to recognize our own emotions and manage our own emotions, the better we're able to help our own kids and our own students learn those same skills.
You had been working with an organization called Turnaround for Children and going through training there. And I know you have 3 R's that you wanted to share with us today. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, this is really, really exciting work. One of the things that I love about this work is that it's rooted in brain science. And so what the science of learning is teaching us is that these new 3 R's, right? So when we were kids, the 3 R's were reading, writing, and arithmetic. And these new 3 R's are relationships, routines, and resilience. Okay. Kids need to, those are 3 R's that help kids get to that calm brain state so they can engage in learning and be their best selves. The brain produces these hormones and these chemicals. And so when we're under extreme stress, our brain produces a hormone called cortisol. And, you know, sometimes a small amount of cortisol is okay and it's actually healthy, right? So if we have a test coming up, we might be a little bit nervous about that test. Some cortisol being released might help us focus in more, might help us motivate us to study harder so we can be prepared for that. But too much cortisol can lead to toxic stress. And this is where damage can occur, where neural pathways aren't functioning correctly. The part of our brain we call the amygdala and the brainstem, the more primitive parts of our brain take over. And it's that fight, flight, freeze response that prevent us from getting to that learning brain. And so one of the antidotes to—
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, the antidote to cortisol is another hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone that is produced when we feel supported and we have strong relationships and we feel loved. And so when you hug somebody who is someone who's close to you, oxytocin is released. And this counteracts that effect of the cortisol. And so one of the things that in schools that we're working to do is systematize mechanisms to build relationships. So kids feel connected to their teachers and they feel connected to their peers at school and they feel connected to the environment and the school principal and all of that. And that helps kids feel calmer and helps kids feel safer when they're in school. There's also things we can do at home as parents to develop that. And so there's things that, for instance, making sure, just things like making sure that you're regularly having family dinner together and carving out family time together to play a game, to go for a walk, to do some exercise, practice mindfulness together as a family. So these are things that can increase feelings of connectedness and increase feelings of relationship, release that oxytocin, and help us learn how to calm ourselves and be in that good state. So relationships is that first R.
Okay.
The second R is routine. And the human brain is really hardwired to recognize patterns. Think about it when you drive to work. Sometimes you don't even think about which way you go. Your brain automatically knows what to do. But when you're in an unfamiliar place, you take a lot more effort and concentration to figure out where you are. And so that energy goes to that. And so if we translate that into school or into home, if we have some routines, that helps kids feel safer because they're not worried about what's going to come next, right? That's going to be automatic. And they can focus more on the sort of critical thinking skills because that sense of routine brings a sense of safety. So that's your second R. And then that third R is resilience. And that's what we want to help build in our students and our kids is this sense of resilience. And so the way we can help them build that resilience is something that we call co-regulating. And so what co-regulating means is really kids are looking to adults to role model. And this is we know this for young children, but it's true for teenagers too. And so they're looking at us when we're in moments of stress. What do we do? Are we taking big calm breaths? Are we managing our own emotions? Are we staying calm? So those are ways that we can help build resilience. Other things we can do are things like limiting exposure to media, because that can be definitely anxiety provoking. And so we want to have thoughtful conversations, but we don't want to overload our kids with what's sometimes going on in the world with a pandemic, because that's scary. And that's young kids and that's older kids as well. And so there's this balance of giving them honest, truthful answers, but also giving them that support and giving and limiting the amount of time that they're spending in front of a screen and looking at that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Your explanation regarding routine, that's the most fascinating explanation about the need for routine that I have heard. So I really appreciate that. That makes so much sense. It just,
when you think about adults, we all have routines, right?
Yeah.
Wake up in the morning, I wake up, I make coffee, I have my cup of coffee, I usually read the morning paper, I have a bowl of cereal, right? And it's almost the same thing every single day, and I don't have to think about it. And it really is a sense of safety.
Yeah, I love that. And they really need that right now. And things are changing very quickly. Schedules are anything but routine, honestly. Right. I mean, I know for most schools, we're 2 days on, 2 days off.
And, that's one of the things that schools are doing is when they're in that school day is having that routine. So for young kids, it might, that same morning routine when you're at school is you put your backpack in this place and this is the schedule for the day. And often a teacher will go over that agenda or that schedule the first thing so that kids can predict what's going to happen next. Right. And the same thing, you can create routines at home as well. And so, and I encourage everyone to think about, what are the basic structures? So whether it's bedtime to get enough sleep and waking up at a similar time, especially on those mornings that school's happening. But pretty soon kids will get that routine and it'll become automatic once you establish it.
Great. Now, we also talk quite a bit about resilience. Parents are always, it's one of the things that parents love to learn about. They want to help their kids to be resilient. And you mentioned one of the things we love to talk about, and that's role modeling that. And role modeling how we're going to handle the pandemic, how we're going to handle the shelter in place when that happened, and now how we're going to handle going back to school, even though it can be very challenging for everybody. I mean, you and I were talking as parents and just working through it and making a plan and showing them it can be done and keeping our anxiety down, because that anxiety is contagious and we definitely don't want to.
And at the same time, I think it's okay to let our kids know that maybe we are feeling a little bit anxious, but it's because that's part of life, right? And kids need to learn those skills. But so we don't want to necessarily hide and pretend that life is rosy all of the time, but we can role model that when we are anxious or there's a new novel situation or there's a challenge that, okay, this is a hard situation. Let's take a breath. Let's think about this. How are we going to attack this? How are we going to attack this problem? How can we problem solve? And so if we can role model that, that's the biggest gift we can give to our kids, right? Life is hard and we're all going to go through some challenges, but how do we handle those challenges and how do we handle those emotions when those situations arise is really important.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think every challenge presents an opportunity, and sometimes it's about reframing. And so, you know, when something happens, we can take a step back and reframe, okay, what are the opportunities in this? You know, I think about a lot of the new skills. You know, pandemic has been a really hard year, but kids and adults, we've all learned all these new skills. We're conducting this interview over Zoom, right? A year and a half ago, nobody used Zoom, nobody used this teleconferencing. And so this was an opportunity to gain new technology skills and that we're going to take with us when pandemic is over and we're back in person.
That's a great point. Even at Tina STEAM, we're finding that we're able to reach a lot of students we wouldn't otherwise be able to reach or out of our area.
Yeah.
So that's a great point. So Dave, you had mentioned that you're working with the schools on how to systematize relationship building. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So schools are acutely aware that a lot of students are struggling. Struggling with connection and struggling with relationships. And we know that that's one of the keys for helping kids feel safe and comfortable. And so things like, I'll give you an example of my son's high school. I got an email the other day, and what they are doing is they are on one of the days of in-person learning. They're now in a hybrid model. They are running lunchtime kickball games out on the field. And so it's an opportunity for students to gather and build relationship. But one of the really interesting things that the counselor wrote in the email to all the parents was that it's also an opportunity for the staff to sort of surreptitiously watch and take note of kids that are having a harder time connecting. And it then allows them to identify those students and then put supports in place to help them, whether it's then a more targeted lunchtime social group or a check-in with a counselor, but allows them to identify those students to give them that extra support they may need. And so, you know, if you are a parent and you've got a student who's struggling to find some connection, I would strongly encourage you to contact your school and ask, you know, what they're doing. How are they supporting students in building relationships, not only with adults on campus, but also peer-to-peer relationships.
You know, Dave, this is such a great example, and it just brings me so much joy to know that our schools are fully aware that this is not easy and they have a plan. They didn't go into this blindly. Another example that I heard, I know when my daughter was young, she had at her school a lunch bunch where kids could volunteer to have lunch with other kids who were kind of struggling emotionally, and they played games. So that might be something that you can help organize at your school.
I love it. I love giving it, you know, it's so scaffolded, right? It's students stepping up to take leadership responsibilities and taking ownership of that process and bringing other kids with them and supporting them socially, emotionally. That's a great.
Exactly. Yeah, that was at our elementary school. And then at their middle school, they had a couple days a week where the counselors would play games with the kids. Any kids that wanted to come into the library could come in and play games so that they got to know the counselors. The counselors could observe and see if there were kids who were struggling, and just made it much easier to approach them than otherwise. I want to encourage parents to please, if you have any questions for Dave, I'm more than happy to get them to him. So even if you're not watching this live, even if it's later, go ahead and type a question in the chat and I will do my best to get an answer to you. Is there anything else that you want to share with parents today before we sign up?
You know, I think just in closing, what I would say is love your kids. That's most important. If you happen to have a student or kid that you think is struggling, don't hesitate to reach out for help, whether that's to the school, whether that's to a professional. That is what is needed during this time. And the prevalence of students who are struggling is really high. And one of the big barriers is this idea around stigma. And that's one of the things that we work really hard is to reduce that stigma that everybody needs a little support now and again. And nobody should be hesitant to reach out for that support if you think that it would be helpful for your student. Right?
All right. Well, thank you. You have a wonderful evening, and thanks again
Thank you.
for helping us.